A teenage girl vanished without a trace in 1987, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. 3 decades of searching yielded nothing, until her mother discovered a hidden diary that would finally reveal the truth. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Eleanor Williams folded the last of her sweaters with practiced precision, tucking it into a cardboard box already filled with decades of memories. After 63 years of life, 30 of them spent wondering what happened to her daughter, she was finally leaving the house where Sarah had grown up. Each item she packed felt heavy with history, weighted by unanswered questions. "Just 3 more boxes," she whispered to herself, her voice echoing in the half-empty bedroom. The realtor had given her until the end of the week, but Eleanor couldn't bear to drag out the process any longer. She reached for a dusty storage container pushed far beneath her bed, one she hadn't opened since before Sarah disappeared in the summer of '87. The lid came off with a soft pop, releasing the scent of old paper and faded perfume. Inside lay forgotten mementos, birthday cards, school photos, and beneath them all, a small leather-bound book with a rusted lock. Sarah's diary. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted it, memories flooding back of her daughter scribbling in it daily, fiercely protective of her private thoughts. As she held the diary, the aged lock suddenly gave way, crumbling between her fingers as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The book fell open in her lap, revealing pages filled with her daughter's looping handwriting. Eleanor hesitated, feeling like an intruder even after 3 decades, but something compelled her to look closer. She began turning pages carefully, noting dates and events from Sarah's final year in Havenwood. The entries detailed ordinary teenage life, school frustrations, dreams for the future, cryptic mentions of friends. But as Eleanor reached the entries from June 1987, her blood ran cold. There was a clear gap in the chronology. Several pages had been torn out, weaving jagged edges along the binding. The missing section began precisely on June 15th, the day Sarah vanished without a trace. "No," Eleanor gasped, frantically flipping back and forth. The entries jumped from June 14th to June 20th, with no explanation for the gap. She examined the torn edges, noticing they weren't ragged or hasty, but clean and deliberate. Someone had removed those pages with careful precision. Her heart pounded as she realized the diary might hold clues that had been hidden from her. And from Tom Avery's investigation, all these years. What secrets had Sarah recorded that someone wanted concealed? And who had access to remove those pages? Eleanor clutched the diary to her chest, suddenly certain that packing up her home had led her to the first real lead in decades. The missing pages were no accident. They were the beginning of a trail she would now follow, no matter where it led. Eleanor Williams sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that held the remnants of her life. After 33 years in this house, the time had come to downsize. Her arthritic fingers worked methodically through each container, sorting memories into piles. Keep, donate, discard. The process was both cathartic and painful. "I've been putting this off for too long," she murmured to herself, lifting a dusty shoebox from beneath a stack of old winter clothes. The box wasn't labeled, but something about its weight felt familiar. When she removed the lid, her breath caught. Inside lay Sarah's belongings, small treasures she'd collected after the police had finished their investigation. The diary was nestled at the bottom, its faded blue cover still intact despite the years. Eleanor had found it tucked between Sarah's mattress and box spring weeks after her disappearance, but the rusted lock had proven stubborn. She'd respected her daughter's privacy then, too consumed by grief to force it open. Now, as if responding to some cosmic timing, the aged metal gave way with a soft click when she lifted it. The lock fell to the floor, and the diary opened in her trembling hands. "Oh, Sarah," Eleanor whispered, tracing her daughter's handwriting with a fingertip. The entries began innocently, School frustrations, crushes, dreams of becoming a writer. But as Eleanor turned the pages, the tone shifted. Sarah's words became guarded, filled with coded references and strange symbols sketched in the margins. A name appeared repeatedly. Met with Jay again today. Jay says I shouldn't tell anyone. Jay understands me like no one else. Eleanor frowned, flipping through more pages. Who was Jay? No one by that name had ever come to their home. Her daughter had kept secrets, significant ones, it seemed. When she reached the entry dated June 15th, Eleanor froze. The next page had been carefully torn out, leaving only jagged edges where the paper had been. June 16th, the very day Sarah vanished. What were you hiding? She asked the empty room, her detective's instinct awakening after decades of dormancy. She continued reading, noting locations mentioned repeatedly. The old mill by the river, a specific corner of the Havenwood Library, the church basement. Places ordinary to anyone else, but clearly significant to Sarah. Eleanor closed the diary and pressed it against her chest. The daughter she thought she knew had lived a parallel life filled with mysteries. The realization brought both dread and a strange, fragile hope. I'll find what happened to you, she promised, rising to her feet with newfound determination. Whatever you were involved in, wherever you went, I'll follow these breadcrumbs until I know the truth. The moving boxes could wait. Eleanor had a new purpose now, beginning with the places Sarah had mentioned. After 30 years of questions, perhaps the answers had been waiting in this attic all along. The Havenwood Public Library stood almost unchanged since Eleanor Williams had last visited it decades ago. The same oak shelves lined the walls, though now they held newer titles alongside the classics. Eleanor's heart pounded as she pushed through the glass doors, the familiar scent of paper and binding glue bringing back memories of afternoons spent here with Sarah. Behind the circulation desk sat Emily Rutherford, her head bent over a computer. The years had etched fine lines around her eyes, but Eleanor recognized her immediately as Sarah's once inseparable friend. Emily looked up, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to shock. Eleanor? It's been so long, she stammered, nervously adjusting her glasses. 30 years, Eleanor replied, placing Sarah's diary on the counter between them. I found this recently. It belonged to my daughter. Emily's eyes darted to the diary, then away. Her fingers fidgeted with a pen. I heard you were selling the house. That must be difficult after all this time. I've been reading through Sarah's entries, Eleanor continued, ignoring the deflection. She mentions someone named Jay quite often. Does that name mean anything to you? The librarian's face paled visibly. We knew so many people back then. Teenage girls, always making new friends. Eleanor watched Emily's reaction carefully. Sarah trusted you. You were her best friend. That was a lifetime ago, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She abruptly stood, claiming she needed to reshelve some returns, but Eleanor noticed how her hands trembled. While Emily busied herself in another aisle, Eleanor glanced around the desk area. Behind the counter, a small bookshelf held what appeared to be Emily's personal collection. Among them, a worn children's book caught her eye. Its spine faded, but the title still visible. The Secret Language of Symbols. Eleanor moved closer, her breath catching when she saw it. The cover featured the same intricate symbols that Sarah had drawn throughout her diary. Circles, intersecting with crescents, and strange angular markings that had seemed like doodles until now. That's not for circulation, Emily said sharply, returning to find Eleanor examining the shelf. These symbols are in Sarah's diary, Eleanor said. The exact same ones. Emily quickly changed the subject, asking about the weather and mentioning a community event. But her eyes kept drifting back to the diary on the counter, as though it might suddenly speak its secrets aloud. When Eleanor finally left the library, the afternoon sun was beginning to wane. She clutched her purse containing Sarah's diary, more certain than ever that Emily Rutherford knew far more than she was willing to share. The evasiveness, the fear in her eyes when Jay was mentioned, the Book of Symbols, they weren't coincidences. Whatever happened to Sarah in 1987, Emily was part of it, and Eleanor was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. Eleanor Williams stood at the edge of the overgrown path leading to the abandoned mill. Her daughter's diary had described this place as magical, a word that seemed at odds with the decrepit structure now looming before her. The once bustling mill had been the heart of Havenwood's economy decades ago, but time had claimed it, leaving only a skeleton of rusted metal and rotting wood. Sarah loved coming here, she whispered to herself, clutching the diary closer as she approached the building. The wooden door groaned in protest as Eleanor pushed it open. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing dust particles in narrow beams. The air inside hung heavy with must and abandonment, making each breath feel like inhaling the past itself. She moved carefully across the uneven floorboards, noting how they creaked beneath her weight. The 63-year-old woman ran her fingers along an old conveyor belt, now frozen in time, imagining her teenage daughter doing the same 30 years earlier. What had Sarah seen in this place? What secrets had it held for her? This was where she mentioned meeting Jay. Eleanor murmured, referencing the mysterious figure from the diary entries. The main floor revealed nothing but cobwebs and memories, so she ventured deeper, following what might have been her daughter's footsteps. Behind the mill stood a small storage shed, its door hanging precariously on rusted hinges. Eleanor hesitated before entering, struck by how closely it matched Sarah's description of a hidden sanctuary away from prying eyes. Inside, the shed was surprisingly less deteriorated than the main building. A beam of light from a small window illuminated what appeared to be recent disturbances in the dust, footprints smaller than her own. Eleanor's heart quickened as she knelt down to examine a corner where the dirt floor seemed recently disturbed. Her breath caught as she uncovered a small muddy sneaker partially buried in the soft earth. She lifted it with trembling hands, noting its relatively modern design and minimal wear. This couldn't possibly have belonged to Sarah. It was far too new and much too small. "Someone's been here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. Recently, the discovery sent a chill through Eleanor's body that had nothing to do with the cool air. Someone else was following Sarah's trail, perhaps even a child. The thought that others might be visiting this abandoned place regularly was unsettling enough, but the buried shoe suggested something more deliberate, more secretive. As she placed the small sneaker in her bag, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in her search. The question was whether this unknown visitor was friend or foe in the mystery of her daughter's disappearance. Eleanor Williams trudged back to her house, her mind still reeling from the discovery at the abandoned mill. The muddy child's sneaker had sent a chill through her body that even the warm afternoon sun couldn't dispel. Too new to have been Sarah's, yet hidden away in that decaying structure. What could it mean? She clutched her handbag tighter, the diary inside feeling suddenly heavier with unanswered questions. As she approached her front porch, something caught her eye. A plain manila envelope resting against her door. No postage, no address, just her name written in neat, controlled handwriting. Eleanor glanced around the quiet street, searching for any sign of the messenger. But Havenwood remained still and indifferent to her scrutiny. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. A small metallic object tumbled into her palm. A tarnished brass key, its teeth worn but distinctive. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just any key. It was identical to the one Sarah had described in her diary entries, the one supposedly meant for a place where secrets stay hidden. "Who would know about this?" she whispered to the empty porch. The key felt warm against her skin, as if carrying the energy of whoever had handled it before her. Someone was watching her investigation unfold. Someone wanted her to continue. That evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the diary splayed open under the harsh light of her reading lamp. The familiar scent of her daughter's perfume still clung faintly to the pages, a ghost of lavender and youth. She traced her fingers over the entries, reading passages she'd already memorized, when something caught her attention, something she'd overlooked before. The handwriting changed subtly in the later entries. Not dramatically, but enough that her mother's eye could detect it. Some passages flowed with Sarah's characteristic looping G's and tilted T's, while others appeared more measured, more deliberate. And the ink. Some entries were written in the deep blue her daughter preferred, while others appeared in a slightly different shade. "How did I miss this?" Eleanor murmured, reaching for her reading glasses for a closer inspection. The implications were disturbing. Had someone else written in Sarah's diary? Or had Sarah herself changed her writing style over time? Either way, it suggested the diary might not be the straightforward record she'd assumed. Eleanor marked the pages with small sticky notes, creating a visual map of the inconsistencies. This was a detail worth remembering. Another thread in the increasingly tangled web surrounding her daughter's disappearance. Tomorrow, she would continue pulling at these threads, no matter where they led. Someone had given her the key. Now she just needed to find the lock it opened. The quiet of Havenwood was disrupted on a crisp autumn morning when Eleanor Williams heard an unfamiliar knock at her door. Opening it, she found herself face to face with a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22 years old, shifting nervously from foot to foot on the porch. "Are you Eleanor Williams?" the stranger asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, studying the young woman's features with growing unease. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, the curve of her cheekbones, the way she tilted her head slightly when speaking. "My name is Rachel Langdon," she said, clutching a small envelope to her chest. "I'm sorry to just show up like this, but I've been searching for my biological mother for almost a year now." Eleanor's hand instinctively tightened on the doorframe. "I don't understand what that has to do with me." Rachel hesitated, then opened the envelope and pulled out a faded newspaper clipping about Sarah's disappearance. "I was adopted as an infant. My parents never knew much about where I came from, but when I turned 21, I found this among my adoption papers." Eleanor invited her inside, her mind racing. As they sat in the living room, Rachel explained how she'd been piecing together fragments of her past, following a trail that somehow led to the Williams family. She spoke of strange dreams about a town she'd never visited, and a melody she couldn't have known. The same lullaby Eleanor had sung to Sarah as a child. "I know this must seem crazy," Rachel said, her eyes welling with tears, "but something drew me here, to this town, to your house." Eleanor studied the young woman across from her. The resemblance was uncanny, not just to Sarah, but to herself in her younger years. The same determined set of the jaw, the same questioning eyes that seemed to look straight through you. "Do you have any photographs?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "From when you were found?" Rachel nodded and pulled out a small, worn photograph of herself as an infant. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The baby was wrapped in a blanket with a pattern she recognized immediately, one her mother had knitted for Sarah's crib decades ago. A spark of hope ignited in Eleanor's chest, burning through years of grief and uncertainty. Could this young woman be connected to Sarah? A niece? A cousin? Or something Eleanor hardly dared consider, a granddaughter? "I don't know what any of this means," Rachel admitted, "but I feel like I was meant to find you." Eleanor reached for her hand, noticing how Rachel's fingers were long and slender, just like Sarah's. This unexpected visitor had added a new layer of urgency to her quest, not just to uncover what happened to her daughter, but to understand who this young woman was and how she fit into the puzzle of their family's fractured history. Eleanor Williams stood outside the library, Clutching Sarah's diary in one hand and the tarnished key in the other, she took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy wooden door. The familiar scent of old books and furniture polish did nothing to calm her nerves. Emily Rutherford looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to unmistakable anxiety when she recognized her visitor. Eleanor approached deliberately, placing the diary and key on the counter between them. "No more half-truths, Emily. I need to know what happened to my daughter." The librarian's hands trembled as she touched the worn cover of the diary. "I've carried this for so long," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Sarah did come to see me that day, the day she disappeared." Eleanor gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. After 30 years of denials, the truth was finally emerging. "You told the police you hadn't seen her." "I was scared," Emily admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "Sarah made me promise. She was different that day. Determined. Frightened." Emily reached beneath her desk and produced a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time. "She gave me this, made me swear I'd keep it hidden and never open it." Her voice cracked. "She said someone might come looking for it someday, but it wasn't safe for anyone to know what was inside." Eleanor stared at the box, her emotions warring between gratitude for this new lead and fury at the decades of silence. "All these years," she said quietly, "while I was falling apart, searching everywhere, you had this." "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, pushing the box toward Eleanor. "I've wanted to tell you so many times, but Sarah was terrified. She made me promise on our friendship." Eleanor reached for the box, noticing how Emily's hands shook as she relinquished it. Did she say where she was going? Who she was afraid of? The librarian shook her head. She mentioned someone called Jay, and she kept looking over her shoulder like she thought she was being followed. Emily hesitated. There's something else. She asked about bus schedules, routes heading north, toward the state line. Eleanor clutched the box to her chest, its weight insignificant compared to the burden of questions it represented. "Thank you," she said stiffly, unsure whether to embrace her daughter's friend or berate her further. As Eleanor turned to leave, Emily called after her. "Eleanor, I think she was trying to protect someone. Maybe herself, maybe someone else." Walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Eleanor felt both lighter and heavier than before. The box in her hands might hold answers, but it also held the weight of 30 years of secrets. Eleanor Williams studied the diary entries for the 5th time, her eyes lingering on the recurring mentions of Jay. The name appeared alongside strange acronyms and coded phrases that seemed deliberately obscured. She traced her finger across the faded ink, wondering if her daughter had created this cipher to hide something important or from someone dangerous. With the diary carefully tucked into her handbag, Eleanor drove to the modest suburban home of Tom Avery. The retired police officer welcomed her with a weary smile that couldn't mask the guilt still etched in his features. He had led the original investigation into Sarah's disappearance, and Eleanor knew the unsolved case had haunted him throughout his career. "I've found something," she said, spreading the diary pages across his kitchen table. "These references to Jay, they're everywhere, but it doesn't seem like a person's name. Look at the context." Tom adjusted his reading glasses, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he examined the entries. The former investigator's expression darkened as he read, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Give me a moment," he said, disappearing into his garage. He returned carrying a dusty cardboard box labeled Williams S., 1987. Eleanor's heart quickened at the sight of her daughter's name. "I kept copies of everything," Tom explained, "even after they told me to close the case." He sifted through yellowed papers and photographs until he found a folder marked Community Programs. "There was this program back then," he said, his voice dropping, "called Juvenile Alternative Youth Program, JAY for short. It operated out of the church, supposedly offering counseling and support for troubled teens." Eleanor leaned forward. Sarah wasn't troubled. No, but the program wasn't what it claimed to be. Tom pulled out a newspaper clipping showing Father Jonas, much younger but with the same penetrating gaze, standing beside a group of teenagers. I had suspicions about their methods. There were rumors of psychological manipulation, even isolation practices. When I tried to investigate, I hit walls everywhere. And Sarah was involved? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know for certain, Tom admitted, but these codes in her diary, they match some of the terminology I uncovered. See this symbol? He pointed to a recurring mark in the margins. I found it on pamphlets distributed by the church. Eleanor felt a chill run through her body. Why didn't you tell me this before? Tom's eyes filled with remorse. The department shut me down, said I was chasing conspiracies, damaging the town's reputation. I was ordered to focus on standard missing persons protocols. He looked directly at Eleanor. I failed you and Sarah, but I'm not bound by those orders anymore. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We're going to need those files, she said, determination hardening her voice. All of them. Eleanor Williams approached the weathered stone steps of Havenwood St. Michael's Church with determination in her stride. The coded phrases about Jay from Sarah's diary weighed heavily on her mind as she pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, Father Jonas was arranging hymnals, his silver-streaked hair catching the colored light from the stained glass windows. Mrs. Williams, he greeted her with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. What brings you to our sanctuary today? Eleanor clutched the diary pages in her pocket. I need to ask you about a program that operated here in the 80s, something called Jay. My daughter Sarah mentioned it in her writings before she disappeared. The priest's hands stilled. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps fear, crossed his face before his expression settled back into pastoral concern. I've been here many years, but I'm afraid I don't recall any such program, he said, turning away to straighten an already perfect row of candles. Perhaps you misunderstood what was written. Sarah wasn't one to make mistakes in her writing, Eleanor pressed. Tom Avery mentioned it might have been an alternative care program run through the church. Father Jonas's shoulders tensed visibly. Tom should be careful about spreading unfounded rumors. The retired officer has always had a creative interpretation of this town's history. When Eleanor mentioned Sarah's frequent visits to the church in the months before her disappearance, the clergyman deflected skillfully, offering platitudes about the comfort faith provides to troubled youth. His evasiveness only strengthened her suspicions. Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned when she knew the church would be empty. The administrative office door was unlocked, a small mercy in a town that still trusted its neighbors. She slipped inside, heart pounding as she searched through the meticulously organized filing cabinets. The records were arranged chronologically, each year neatly labeled. But when she reached 1987, Eleanor found a conspicuous gap. 3 months of records, including the summer when Sarah vanished, were missing entirely. In the remaining folders, several pages appeared to have been removed, leaving jagged edges where they'd been torn out. Most telling was a single sheet she found misfiled in a folder labeled Building Maintenance. It contained a partial list of names, with Williams S. clearly visible near the bottom, followed by initials, JP Program Candidate. Eleanor photographed the document with trembling hands, then carefully returned everything to its original place. As she slipped out of the church, the weight of discovery pressed against her chest. Whatever J was, it wasn't just a passing reference in her daughter's diary. It was something the church had gone to great lengths to erase, and Sarah had somehow been involved. The missing records confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Her daughter's disappearance was part of something larger, something powerful enough to warrant a decades-long cover-up. Eleanor Williams sat nervously in the small recording booth of Havenwood's local radio station, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. After weeks of private investigation, she had decided to take her search public. The station manager had been hesitant at first, but the story of a mother's 30-year quest to find her missing daughter proved too compelling to refuse. "My daughter Sarah disappeared in 1987, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We recently found her diary, and I believe there are people in this town who know what happened to her." The broadcast generated an immediate response. By the following morning, Eleanor's phone rang constantly with calls from townsfolk claiming to have information. Some seemed genuinely concerned, offering memories of Sarah from that summer. Others were clearly seeking attention, their stories contradicting known facts. "You need to be careful," Tom Avery warned when they met for coffee. The retired police officer looked troubled as he pushed a folder across the table. "Going public has stirred up more than memories. People are protective of Havenwood's reputation." Eleanor nodded, remembering how Father Jonas had reacted when she'd questioned him about the J program. The priest had practically pushed her out of the church office, his normally composed demeanor cracking under her persistent questions. Among the flood of tips, one anonymous caller mentioned a specific book at the library. "Check the third shelf, historical fiction section," the voice had whispered before hanging up. The next day, Eleanor found herself back at the library, scanning shelves under Emily Rutherford's watchful gaze. The librarian seemed more agitated than during their previous encounter, repeatedly glancing toward the historical fiction section. When Emily stepped away to help another patron, Eleanor seized her chance. The book was exactly where the caller had described, a historical novel about a mother searching for her lost child. As she flipped through the pages, her heart nearly stopped. There, in the margins, were notes written in handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Sarah's distinctive looping script. More shocking than the handwriting itself was the date scrawled beside one comment. March 15, 2018, barely 2 years earlier. Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, mind racing. Either someone had perfectly forged her daughter's handwriting, or the impossible was true. Sarah was alive and had been in Havenwood recently. As she approached the checkout desk, Emily's face paled at the sight of the book in Eleanor's hands. "Where did you find that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I think you know exactly where I found it," Eleanor replied, studying her daughter's childhood friend carefully. "And I think you know who's been writing in it, too." Emily's eyes darted toward the exit, as if contemplating escape. The radio broadcast had done more than stir memories. It had disturbed secrets long buried in Havenwood's quiet streets. The spring fair in Havenwood had been a town tradition for generations. Colorful tents dotted the fairgrounds, children's laughter mingling with carnival music as Eleanor Williams made her way through the crowds. She'd chosen this public yet chaotic setting deliberately. They would be hidden in plain sight. Tom Avery arrived first, his weathered face scanning the area with the practiced vigilance of his former profession. The retired police officer nodded toward a secluded bench near the cotton candy stand. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eleanor said, her voice nearly lost in the ambient noise. "Some cases never leave you," he replied, patting a manila folder tucked under his arm. "This one's haunted me for 30 years. They were soon joined by Rachel Langdon, her youthful face a stark contrast to their lined expressions. The 22-year-old seemed nervous, fidgeting with something around her neck as she approached. "I brought everything I have," Rachel said, producing a small cloth pouch. "It's not much, just fragments my adoptive mother saved." As carnival rides whirled in the background, the three huddled together, comparing their pieces of the puzzle. Tom spread out photocopies of police reports, pointing to inconsistencies in witness statements. Eleanor shared selected diary entries, carefully translated from Sarah's cryptic language. "There's something else," Rachel whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the chain around her neck. She pulled out a pendant, a small silver bird with wings outstretched, a tiny blue stone set as its eye. Eleanor's breath caught. Her hands shook as she fumbled through her purse, extracting a faded photograph. In it, a teenage Sarah smiled at the camera, wearing an identical pendant. "Where did you get this?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. "I've had it my whole life. My adoptive mother said it was the only thing I was wearing when they found me." Tom leaned forward, examining the necklace. The timing would match. If Sarah disappeared and then… Eleanor couldn't finish his sentence. The implication was too overwhelming. That Sarah had been pregnant when she vanished, that she had given birth somewhere in secret. That Rachel might be? "I think I'm your granddaughter," Rachel said simply, tears welling in her eyes. The fair continued around them, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring on that bench. Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers, touching the pendant that connected them across decades of silence. "Sarah always said this bird represented freedom," Eleanor whispered, "that someday she would fly away from everything that hurt her." Tom cleared his throat. "We need to be careful. If Rachel is Sarah's daughter, then whatever drove Sarah to disappear might still be a threat." As dusk fell over the fairgrounds, the three made plans to continue their investigation, bound now not just by curiosity, but by blood. Eleanor looked at Rachel, at the shape of her eyes, so familiar, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 30 years. Hope. Tom Avery's hands trembled slightly as he slid the dusty folder across the table toward Eleanor Williams. After weeks of calling in favors from former colleagues, the retired police officer had finally gained access to the restricted files from 1987, files that had been deliberately kept from public view for 3 decades. "I had to sign my life away to get these," Tom said, his weathered face grim. "Now I understand why they were buried so deep." Eleanor opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were internal memos, interview transcripts, and handwritten notes that painted a disturbing picture. The documents revealed that Havenwood's authorities had received explicit instructions to handle Sarah's case with unusual discretion. One memo, signed by the then mayor, specifically mentioned protecting our community's reputation as a priority above pursuing speculative leads. "They barely looked for her," Eleanor whispered, rage building in her chest as she flipped through page after page of prematurely closed investigative avenues. "They just gave up." Tom nodded solemnly. "The chief told me to focus on runaways, not abduction. When I pushed back, I was reassigned. I always wondered why." A particular document caught Eleanor's attention. A report detailing a witness who claimed to have seen Sarah near the church the evening before her disappearance. The witness had later recanted their statement after a private meeting with Father Jonas. The recantation had never been questioned. "The church," Eleanor said, connecting dots that had eluded her for years. "The J program, Father Jonas, the missing records, they're all linked." Tom pointed to another document, this one detailing how several prominent community members, including church officials, had pressured the department to conclude that Sarah had simply run away. Their influence had effectively derailed any meaningful investigation. "The system failed you, Eleanor. Failed Sarah," the former officer said, regret etched into every line of his face. "I failed you both." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. All these years, she'd believed that everything possible had been done to find her daughter. Now she understood that powerful figures in Havenwood had orchestrated a cover-up, protecting their interests while her family shattered. "Father Jonas knows more than he's saying," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "And I think it goes beyond just him. The whole town was complicit." Tom nodded grimly. "The question is, what were they hiding that was worth sacrificing a young girl for?" Eleanor carefully gathered the documents, her mind racing. The truth was finally emerging from decades of darkness, and she wouldn't stop until every secret was exposed, no matter who it implicated. Emily Rutherford arrived at Eleanor's doorstep, clutching a weathered shoebox to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were rimmed red, Her shoulders slumped with the weight of decades-old guilt. "I should have given this to you years ago," Emily whispered, extending the box toward Eleanor Williams. "Sarah made me promise to keep it safe. I never opened it until yesterday." Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the container. Inside, nestled among tissue paper yellowed with age, lay fragments of her daughter's secret life. Letters torn in half, as if Sarah had second thoughts about their contents. Photographs showing her daughter with cropped hair dyed a deep auburn, a stark transformation from the long blonde locks Eleanor had brushed each morning. "I barely recognized her," Emily said, pointing to one image. "She came to me that day looking completely different, said she needed to disappear for a while." Eleanor's breath caught as she lifted a particular photograph. Sarah, her face thinner but eyes bright, wearing the distinctive silver pendant, an intricate tree design with a small blue stone embedded in its trunk. The same necklace Rachel Langdon now wore around her neck. "This can't be coincidence," Eleanor murmured, carefully setting the photo aside. Tom Avery, who had arrived earlier to discuss his findings, leaned forward. "The timing matches what we suspected," he said, his voice carrying the professional detachment of his police background despite his retirement. At the bottom of the box, partially hidden beneath a folded note, lay a hospital identification bracelet. Eleanor lifted it with shaking fingers, reading the printed information. Jane Cooper, admitted November 12, 1987, nearly 4 months after Sarah's disappearance. "A maternity ward bracelet," Tom confirmed, examining it closely. Cooper wasn't a random alias. Sarah's favorite author was James Fenimore Cooper, Eleanor finished, memories washing over her. She read The Last of the Mohicans 3 times one summer. Emily sank into a chair, tears streaming freely now. "I suspected she might be pregnant, but she never confirmed it. When she left the library that day, she said something about protecting someone who didn't exist yet." Eleanor's mind raced to Rachel, 22 years old, which aligned perfectly with a birth in late 1987. The necklace, the timing, the resemblance that had struck her from their first meeting. "She gave birth in secret," Eleanor whispered, clutching the bracelet. "But why run? Who was she afraid of?" Tom's expression darkened. "That's where those restricted files might help. Someone powerful enough to pressure the police department into backing off. Someone Sarah feared enough to abandon her entire life." Eleanor carefully gathered the items, each one a puzzle piece in her daughter's fractured story. "Rachel needs to see these," she said firmly. "She deserves to know who her mother was, who she is." The autumn chill seeped through Eleanor Williams' coat as she and Rachel Langdon approached the abandoned mill. Clutching Sarah's diary, Eleanor traced her finger over the faded ink describing this very location. The structure loomed before them, its weathered timbers groaning in the wind like a forgotten sentinel. "My mother wrote about this place so often," Rachel whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "It feels strange to walk where she walked." Eleanor nodded silently. The young woman's presence beside her, her granddaughter, still felt surreal. They entered cautiously, flashlight beams dancing across decades of dust and abandonment. The librarian's revelation about the box had changed everything, its contents confirming what Eleanor had begun to suspect. Sarah hadn't simply vanished. She had chosen to disappear. According to the diary, she mentioned a loose board near the eastern window, Eleanor said, directing her light toward the far wall. Rachel moved carefully across the creaking floor, testing boards with her foot. "Here," she called suddenly. "This one moves." Together they knelt, prying up the weathered plank to reveal a small cavity beneath. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached inside, extracting a metal container sealed with duct tape. The retired police officer, Tom Avery, had warned them to document everything, so Rachel snapped photos with her smartphone before Eleanor carefully broke the seal. Inside lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a small notebook, all preserved in plastic. Eleanor gasped at a photo of Sarah, her hair cut short, cradling an infant wrapped in a blue blanket. The date stamp showed 3 months after her disappearance. "That's me," Rachel whispered, touching the image with reverent fingers. Eleanor unfolded one letter, immediately recognizing her daughter's flowing handwriting. The words blurred through her tears. "I can't come home. They're still watching. If they find out about the baby, we'll never be safe. I've made arrangements for her to be found by someone who will love her. Someday, when it's safe, I'll find a way to let Mom know I'm alive. Until then, this has to be goodbye." Rachel leaned against Eleanor, both women silent in their shared grief and revelation. The letter confirmed what the hospital bracelet had suggested. Sarah had fled to protect her child from some unnamed danger, possibly connected to the mysterious J program Tom had mentioned. "She loved you," Eleanor finally said, "enough to give you up." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And she loved you enough to leave these breadcrumbs." As they carefully gathered the evidence, Eleanor noticed something else in the hidden compartment, a small folded map with locations marked in red ink. The trail hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Dr. Marcus Whitfield adjusted his glasses as he carefully examined the diary under specialized lighting. Eleanor Williams watched anxiously, her hands clasped tightly together as the forensic document expert meticulously analyzed each page of Sarah's diary. "There's something unusual here," Dr. Whitfield said, pointing to a section of entries. "The ink composition changes subtly between these entries from June and these from July. And look at these loops in the letter Y. They're consistently rounded in the earlier entries, but become more angular later." Eleanor leaned closer, her heart racing. The expert continued his examination, comparing paper fibers and ink degradation across different sections of the diary. What he revealed confirmed her growing suspicion. Some entries had been written years after Sarah's disappearance. "These pages here," the specialist indicated, "show chemical markers consistent with ink manufactured in the late 90s, while these earlier pages contain compounds from the 80s. Someone has been adding to this diary long after your daughter vanished." The revelation sent a chill through Eleanor's body. She recalled the strange inconsistency she'd noticed. Slight variations in pressure, the way certain words slanted. It wasn't just her imagination after all. "Could it be Sarah herself?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Whitfield hesitated. "I can't confirm identity, but whoever wrote these later entries went to extraordinary lengths to mimic the original handwriting. There are microscopic hesitations in the strokes, signs of someone trying to copy rather than writing naturally." The implications were staggering. Someone had been maintaining Sarah's voice through the diary, creating an illusion of continuity. But why? Was it to mislead Eleanor, keeping her chasing ghosts? Or was there something more sinister at play, a truth so dangerous it needed to remain hidden? "There's something else," the expert added, examining a particular entry about Jay and the church. "This page shows signs of having been removed and then reinserted. The binding damage is subtle but unmistakable." Eleanor remembered Tom Avery's revelations about the church's alternative care program. Could Father Jonas be involved in manipulating the diary? Or was it Emily, who had access to Sarah's possessions? As she left with the diary carefully wrapped in protective material, Eleanor felt both violated and strangely hopeful. If someone had gone to such lengths to maintain this deception, then the truth about Sarah must be worth protecting or worth hiding. Either way, she was closer than ever to discovering what really happened to her daughter 30 years ago. Eleanor Williams walked into the Havenwood Gazette office, clutching a folder of evidence that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. The forensic expert's report lay on top, confirmation that the diary entries varied in age, with some written years after Sarah had vanished. The subtle differences in ink composition and paper aging couldn't be denied. Someone had been maintaining the illusion of Sarah's voice through carefully crafted entries. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore," Eleanor told Marjorie Kent, the newspaper's veteran editor. "It's about deception that's gone on for 3 decades in this town." The next morning's headline sent shockwaves through Havenwood. "Mother uncovers evidence of manipulation in daughter's disappearance." Within hours, Eleanor's phone rang constantly. Some calls came from supportive neighbors offering information they'd withheld for years. Others were angry accusations from residents who felt the town's peaceful reputation was being needlessly tarnished. "You're dredging up ancient history," one caller hissed. "Some things are better left buried." Tom Avery stood by Eleanor's side during a hastily arranged press conference outside the Gazette. The retired officer's presence lent credibility to her claims as journalists from neighboring towns descended on Havenwood, microphones extended like weapons. "The forensic analysis confirms what we've suspected," Tom explained, his voice steady despite the cameras. "These entries weren't all written by Sarah at the same time. Someone has been crafting this narrative, manipulating Eleanor's understanding of what happened." The revelation about the J program drew particular interest. 3 reporters began investigating the connection between the church and the alternative care initiative that had operated in the shadows of Havenwood's respectable facade. Father Jonas became increasingly difficult to reach. When a persistent journalist finally cornered him outside the church, the usually composed priest snapped. "This community has healed. Eleanor Williams is reopening wounds that serve no purpose except to divide us." His uncharacteristic outburst was captured on video and quickly spread through social media. The following Sunday, his congregation was noticeably smaller. Rachel Langdon watched the unfolding media storm with growing unease. "I never expected this," she confided to Eleanor as they sat in the older woman's living room, away from the cameras. "I came looking for my mother, not to expose a town's secrets." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever, dear. Someone has been writing in Sarah's voice, keeping this mystery alive while hiding the real story." She looked down at the forensic report. "And I think they've been doing it to lead us somewhere or to someone." That night, Eleanor received an anonymous text message. "You're getting closer, but be careful who you trust." The story in the Havenwood Gazette spread like wildfire. Eleanor Williams stood in her living room, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, each featuring her daughter's face and the headline, "Mother Uncovers New Evidence in Decades-Old Disappearance." The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the article was published. Some calls came from supportive neighbors, others from angry townspeople who felt she was disrupting their peaceful community. "You're opening old wounds," one caller had hissed before hanging up. But Eleanor couldn't stop now, not when she was finally getting closer to the truth about Sarah. The division in town became increasingly visible. At the grocery store, some people crossed the aisle to avoid her, while others approached with tearful embraces and whispered encouragements. Tom Avery called daily, updating her on the growing public pressure for authorities to re-examine the case. Father Jonas was particularly vocal in his opposition. During his Sunday sermon, he spoke about the dangers of dwelling in the past and the importance of community healing, thinly veiled references to Eleanor's investigation. His agitation became more pronounced when reporters began asking pointed questions about the church's involvement in the mysterious J program from the 80s. 3 days after the article ran, Eleanor received a call from the newspaper office. "Mrs. Williams, you need to see this," said the editor, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Our security cameras caught something last night." The surveillance footage was grainy but clear enough. A middle-aged woman with a scarf partially obscuring her face approached the front desk after hours, slipping an envelope through the mail slot before quickly disappearing into the night. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the envelope the woman had left. Inside was a yellowed page, the missing diary entry, and a handwritten note on modern paper. Forgive me, I had no choice. The handwriting struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Though more mature and steady than the teenage scrawl in the diary, it was unmistakably Sarah's. The fluid loops of her G's, the distinctive way she crossed her T's. Eleanor would recognize it anywhere. She had stared at her daughter's handwriting for 30 years, memorizing every curve and line. "It's her," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible as she showed the note to Tom and Rachel, who had joined her at the Gazette office. Sarah is alive. The implications were staggering. If Sarah was alive, she had been watching, orchestrating, guiding Eleanor's search from the shadows. Every clue, every revelation, perhaps even Rachel's arrival in Havenwood, might have been part of Sarah's plan. "But why now?" Rachel asked, her eyes wide with confusion and hope. "Why not come forward years ago?" Eleanor clutched the note to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Because something was keeping her away, and I think she's finally ready to tell us what it was." Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the pendant around her neck, the weight of truth suddenly making the familiar piece of jewelry feel foreign against her skin. After leaving Eleanor's house, she drove straight to the suburban home where she'd grown up, her mind racing with questions that had haunted her for 22 years without her even knowing. Margaret Langdon opened the door to find her daughter standing there, tears streaming down her face. "You knew, didn't you?" Rachel whispered, holding up the necklace. "You knew I wasn't really yours." Inside the living room where Rachel had opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, Margaret's composure crumbled. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Your father and I found you near the old mill. You were just a tiny thing, wrapped in a blanket, wearing that necklace." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Rachel demanded, pacing across the carpet where she'd once played as a child. The older woman wiped her eyes. "We did, but quietly. The officer told us there had been a young woman at Havenwood Memorial Hospital who gave birth under a false name and disappeared shortly after. He suggested," she paused, "he suggested it might be better for everyone if we simply took you in." The next morning, Eleanor and Rachel visited the hospital archives. A sympathetic administrator helped them locate records from 30 years ago. A patient named Jane Smith, who matched Sarah's description, had indeed given birth to a baby girl. The handwritten notes mentioned the mother appeared frightened, constantly checking the windows and doors. "She left in the middle of the night," the administrator explained, pointing to the hastily completed discharge forms. "Against medical advice." Rachel stared at the birth certificate, her fingers tracing the space where a mother's real name should have been. "She was protecting me from something," she whispered. "Or someone." Eleanor placed her hand over Rachel's. "From whatever threat made her run in the first place," she agreed. "But she made sure you'd be found somewhere safe." That evening, as they sat in Eleanor's kitchen, grandmother and granddaughter united by blood and separated by decades of secrets, Rachel finally allowed herself to feel the connection she'd been searching for her entire life. "I have your eyes," she said quietly to Eleanor. "Everyone always said they didn't know where I got them." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Sarah's eyes, too." She reached across the table, taking Rachel's hand. "All these years, I thought I'd lost everything. But you were here all along. The pain of 30 years didn't vanish, but it transformed into something new, a fragile bridge between loss and hope, between the family that was shattered and the one that might still be rebuilt." Golden autumn leaves carpeted Havenwood as the first chill of the season settled over the town. Eleanor Williams sat in her living room, the warm glow of table lamps casting long shadows across the walls. Across from her, Rachel Langdon cradled a cup of tea between her hands, her eyes, so much like Sarah's, darting occasionally to the photographs spread across the coffee table. Tom Avery stood by the window, his weathered face reflecting both relief and lingering regret. "I still can't believe it," Rachel whispered, touching the edge of a yellowed photograph. All these years I wondered who I really was. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Sarah loved you enough to protect you, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The retired police officer turned from the window. The church records we found confirm it. Father Jonas knew about the threats Sarah was receiving. The J program wasn't just alternative care. It was a cover for something much darker. Rachel, shaken by the mounting evidence, described her confrontation with her adoptive mother the previous day. The woman had broken down in tears, finally confessing to finding Rachel as an infant near the old mill, wearing the distinctive pendant necklace. She'd kept the truth hidden for 22 years, fearing Rachel would be taken away. She showed me the blanket I was wrapped in, Rachel said, her voice trembling. And a note that just said, "Keep her safe." Eleanor nodded slowly. Sarah's handwriting. Tom placed several documents on the table, hospital records under a false name that confirmed Sarah had given birth and disappeared again shortly after. The pieces were finally falling into place. Rachel was indeed Sarah's daughter and Eleanor's granddaughter. The years of pain and loss were transforming into a fragile sense of hope. "I've spent 30 years wondering if she was dead," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. "Now I wonder if she's been watching us all along." As evening deepened into night, Tom departed, promising to return the following day. Rachel fell asleep on the couch, emotionally exhausted. Eleanor covered her with a blanket, studying the young woman's face, the unmistakable echo of her daughter. Later, unable to sleep, Eleanor stepped onto the porch for fresh air. There, placed carefully on the railing, was the diary, the very one that had started this journey. Her hands trembled as she opened it to find a fresh page added to the back. The handwriting was unmistakable, the message brief but profound. Sarah didn't disappear. She chose a path, but now it's time to come home. Eleanor clutched the diary to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Then came a sound she'd imagined in 1,000 dreams, a gentle knock at the door.